All right, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us on this Introduction to CANDOR webinar. My name is Sanford, and I am the CANDOR Project Manager for Compass HIN. I'm very excited to have you all on the call here with us today. Before we get started, though, I'd like to take a minute just to remind everybody to please mute your phones, and that way we can eliminate any extra noise. Also, please do not place us on hold, as we will hear your lovely hold music during the call. We'd like to find out who's in the room today, so if you could just type in your name, facility, and role in the chat box, that would be great. And while you're doing that, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the topics that we're going to cover today. So first, we're going to discuss the opportunity for participation in the Summer CANDOR Training Series and what is involved in that. Next, Dr. Tim McDonald will talk about what CANDOR is and the key elements involved and why it is so important. Then we will hear from Dr. Mike McCoy, CMO at Great River Health System, and Dr. McCoy will be joined by Great River patient Ray and his sister Deb to share their story with you of their CANDOR experience. Finally, we will hear from Shelley Davis at MMIC and Gary Tettenborn from COPIC as they discuss CANDOR from the insurer's perspective. Great, that's wonderful. It's great to see you all with us today. So starting in June 2018, IHC, IMS, IHA, and the MedStar Institute for Quality and Safety are pleased to invite you to participate in the Summer CANDOR Training Series. The series is made up of 4 training workshops meant to cover the various elements of CANDOR. As you can see there, we've got the dates and topics listed for the webinars. And the workshops will be an all-day event. They're going to be held on site at the Iowa Medical Society, and a travel stipend will be provided. I will be sending out a handout after the call today with additional information. Prior to the on-site workshops, we will be offering the opportunity to conduct a gap analysis at your facility. The subject matter experts from the MedStar Institute for Quality and Safety will be able to walk you through that process and assist you with anything that you may need. Again, there will be more details to come in the handout. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Tim McDonald. Dr. McDonald is the Director for the Center for Open and Honest Communication at the MedStar Institute for Quality and Safety and an internationally recognized patient safety expert. Tim's a physician attorney who has been involved in patient care activities for the past 30 years and quality and patient safety efforts for the past 20 years. He served as the Chief Safety and Risk Officer for Health Affairs and was the Program Director for the Pediatric Anesthesiology Residency Program at the University of Illinois. His research is focused on the principled approach to quality, medical liability, and patient harm, with an emphasis on the robust reporting of patient safety events, open and honest communication following harm, and the use of simulation and human factors analysis to improve healthcare systems and processes. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Tim.
Oh, thank you very much. And it's a real honor to be with you all on the call, including our patient and family who's joined us, as well as Dr. McCoy and those from MMIC and COPIC, a lot of really great people involved in this super important work. If you could go to the next slide. I like to use this this sort of reflection as a way to get to the heart of what this is all about. And I particularly like the last sentence where Mother Teresa speaks to trust, honesty, humility, transparency, and accountability being the building blocks of a positive reputation. And it's been really fantastic to work with so many different hospitals around the country over the last couple of years as they begin to move in this direction, which often we refer to as nothing more than normalizing compassionate honesty. Next slide. The criticality around this is the fact that we know that if you were to put preventable medical harm into its own diagnostic bucket, this article here by Macri, who's a surgeon at Hopkins, identified with new research that that bucket would now represent the third leading cause of death in the US, just behind cancer and heart disease. Next slide. The critical part that we've learned over the years, though, is that all too often when things happen, unexpected things happen, when harm occurs to our patients unexpectedly, the natural tendency for a lot of people is to lean back instead of leaning in. And we build this wall of silence around ourselves as caregivers, hospital administrators, other clinicians, between us and patients and families, and also amongst each other, where people are often left suffering in silence. And the whole goal of CANDOR, standing for communication and optimal resolution, is to shatter that wall of silence in every possible way. Break down that wall between us and our fellow care providers, but also that may happen between us and our patients and families, with the goal to learn from these unexpected events, but also provide emotional first aid for everybody involved, because nobody comes into work expecting something unexpected to happen. Next slide. So we know that there are these cases, and we had one at the University of Illinois, and I'll let you go through all of these till we get to the end. There's a bunch of them that'll just line up that you'll be able to do there. Yeah, you can keep going through those. But at any rate, we had the COO of Michael Reese Hospital who came to the University of Illinois in the early 2000s in preparation for surgery she was going to have prior to her getting married. And pre-op CBC showed a white count of 1,000. We missed it. Our team missed it in anesthesia, where I was working in that department at the time. Surgery missed it. Our whole perioperative process missed it. And she undergoes the surgical procedure without us being mindful of that low white count. The post-op CBC showed now a white count of less than 500, which is a very critical test result. But in a whole variety of systems issues, we never acted upon it. It apparently got called to somebody who we could never really identify, who would have been on the floor at the time when that call went through. And sadly, she died 6 weeks later from a treatable leukemia at Northwestern. And when we reached out to our leadership at the time to say, hey, we'd really like to talk to the family, particularly the fiance, and explain to them what happened. She was part of us. I mean, she was the COO of a hospital that was very close to us. And unfortunately, at that time in the early 2000s, there wasn't a process, and there was a lot of fear around reaching out. And so when we did get sued, we delayed, denied, and defended it for years, and we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars doing that. We settled for millions, but most importantly, we learned little, and we suffered immensely through that, in that wall of silence. And the suffer immensely also involved the family members. In fact, with the Copic people online, you may or may not be aware of this. Jerry Lewis Jenkins, who I believe still works for Copic, was this woman's best friend. In fact, Jerry Lewis did her eulogy. And in talking to the family, she described how bad the family felt about us at the University of Illinois for being so opaque and not transparent. And I found that out through a lot of the work I've done with Copic and the friendship I've had with Jerry Lewis in this area. So just a horrible example of lots of opportunities to do it differently. So next slide. One of the things that we know is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So one of the big goals, as you'll hear from Dr. McCoy as well, is that the goal is to make sure that the culture of the organizations change. They kind of engage in this paradigm shift, because without that, any strategy we have in patient safety is not going to be as effective as otherwise it would be. Next slide. And this is important stuff that we deal with, because you can develop this sort of culture of this unkind acts cascade, where you can see that top picture there is sort of what we did to this family, where she died due to, in part, of mistakes that we made, where we basically tell them, speak to the hand. And there's a lot of collateral damage that then happens to the families when this sort of thing occurs, but also within the care community, within the team, in terms of how horrible that we feel when we're in a position where either we're told not to talk about it, or just a natural tendency is to lean back and suffer behind that wall of silence. Next slide. And this leads to one of the critical things we're seeing more and more in, which is burnout in our organizations. And you can see that the symptoms, both psychological and physical, are the ones associated with burnout. And many of the people who we've talked to who've not had that opportunity to break down that wall of silence, to work with their colleagues, but also with patients and families, are the kind of things that they often experience. Next slide. And so this approach to candor is way beyond just, we're going to do early offer and resolution. It's much more about learning and hugging and loving patients and families as well as caregivers through this. This slide may be a little bit difficult to see, but it's really important because the light blue shows the change in burnout by specialty over the last 4 years. And you can see a lot of specialties sort of up towards the top. You now have a very dangerous situation where more than 50% of the folks that are in these specialties are experiencing burnout. And next slide, that is a critical issue as it relates to staff engagement, as well as patient safety. This reference here we have that comes from AHRQ, which was the sponsoring agency for the development of the Candor Toolkit. You can see this article discusses the fact that when you measure burnout in some of your units, those units that have the highest physician and nurse burnout also have are associated with the highest mortality rate of observed over expected. And there's now many other quality articles that show that units that have burnout have higher CAUTI rates and some of the other things that we like to measure from the quality perspective. And so addressing this head on by breaking down the wall of silence and bringing some of the components of candor into wellness, resilience, burnout management, and others, organizations are beginning to find that super effective. Next slide. So to that end, we identified in the early 2000s, there's a better way to do this. And in large part, we learned a ton from Rick Boothman at the University of Michigan, who was the real pioneer moving this stuff forward there, where we had a chance to go there, learn a lot from him. We went to Michigan, he came to Illinois. We shared a lot of what we were doing and essentially adopted a lot of his position on this, as well as we added some more, which has come into be this sort of, what are the principles of candor in general? And that is to provide effective communication rapidly, following all serious harm events, apologizing and fairly and rapidly resolving all cases where you have a full consensus, where people agree, including the med mal insurers, that this care was bad, it was inappropriate, and it's the kind of situation that needs to be, in certain circumstances, positioned for early offer. And then making sure we learn from our mistakes, and as importantly, and as I mentioned, we will hug and love the patients, families, and caregivers throughout this process. Next slide. So initially, when we thought of putting this together, this was the diagram we put together, and we submitted to some of our patient advocates. And when we shared this with them, they really called us out, saying, we just really didn't get, what this patient harm, problem is and how it really affects patient and families. Initially, we did this sort of like a Sorry Works program, where an event happened, if there's harm, we would look into it. And if care was bad, we would go ahead and say, we're sorry. And in some cases, provide remediation. And what's wrong with this approach that they told us right away that we jumped in and redesigned is there's no early communication to patients and families. What we learned from them that gets built into a robust candor approach is that every hour that goes by without effective communication is another harm. And you can see within this, that wouldn't happen at all with this flow diagram, where we're not done talking to patients and families in the meantime. The other piece is we weren't mindful of who is going to be having these conversations, because as we all know in our institutions, there are some people who are much better communicators than others. I mean, it's like any skill that we have. Also not on this flow diagram is the learning and how we're going to improve. And there's nothing in here about supporting the caregiver. That's sort of either second victim or second patient, or the caregiver who needs support was not on this diagram at all. And also what's not listed in here from the learning perspective are the non-harm events. This is all stuff we learned when we pushed this out to people to get advice on, were we getting close to a appropriate process. So next slide. And this just calls the question, which then led us to the next slide, which is after input from patients and families, is what became known as the 7 pillars. And I apologize for the kind of the way that the screenshot looked here, but it's, as you can kind of follow through, when events happen, we added that component of there's no patient harm. Those were near misses that got put into the process improvement bucket. And then when there is harm, finding ways to activate crisis management if you need to, but also consider that second patient, do the event review, and real importantly, figure out a way to handle the bills. We made a huge mistake at the U of I when we did a wrong-sided neurosurgery case. We then billed that patient and then we sent them to collections. That was not a particularly useful way to approach a harm event. And then there's this whole part around developing a communication consult or coaching service available 24/7, where people with good communication skills who have been trained are available to either help with the communication or coach folks through the communication in a way where we're mindful of the physician still being the point people in most organizations as those who would be part of a communication of an unexpected event. And then finally, if there is inappropriate care, how do we provide some sort of closure with a apology and then a remedy that would go along with that? And then, of course, all this linked to the process improvements, which again is the whole goal of the learning that we're hoping to be there. And again, right there in the middle, focusing on the second patient or the second victim who may have been impacted. Next slide. So this then, because of a lot of the really positive data that we got over time from the funding we got from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, we were able to get more funding, work with people like Rick Boothman from Michigan, the folks from Sanford, the state of Washington, and other places in the country to build what became known as the CANDOR Toolkit. There you see communication and optimal resolution, where there really is this opportunity to change the way that we approach things. And so you can see there's kind of 5 buckets here that represent where there are some best practices that we can help organizations in any of these domains, depending on what the needs are of the organization. And that's the value of the gap analysis that was mentioned early on, where we have a team of people. We've done hundreds of these now, where we go into an organization, we get a chance in one day to review documents, but also speak to, through facilitated focus groups, the people in the organization who can help share with us where is the organization's culture and where is their process in activating a response to harm. Where 3 you can see is the response and communication. So that's care for the caregiver and communication to families. And the bottom part is that human factors-based event review, where as you learn more, you share more. And as you learn more, you share more until ultimately you have enough information where you can resolve this, where most of the time, over 90% of the time, it's going to be care was okay, but then also open up that opportunity to resolve financially if, again, everybody and all the stakeholders agree that is the appropriate thing moving forward. Next slide. So this has led to this paradigm shift for all of those buckets, where we move from the delayed, sort of reporting to immediate. Some organizations have found it useful to establish a hotline to where they can call and get that communication coaching, or have the care for the caregiver team launched right away to support the caregivers. And you can see this shift goes all the way through to the point of the communication part, event review, where it's focused on human factors instead of shame, blame, and train. And then primarily, again, also blasting that wall of silence around care for the caregiver, where you move from people suffering in isolation to getting immediate support, and ultimately the resolution part. Next slide. So at the end of the day, we call these communication and resolution programs comprehensive, principled, and systematic approaches to the prevention and response to patient harm. These are patient safety programs that happen to have, at least the data now shows, a big upside on the liability piece. But again, they are primarily patient safety programs. One of the ways to think about this immediate response to patient harm, and this is one of the things that we've done at MedStar, is to think of it in terms of creating a go team. Next slide. And this is kind of built after the notion that in the lives of these patients, this is like a plane crash. And as the NTSB would respond, we talk about how we respond as professionals or organizations. How we respond at these most difficult times defines who we are as a profession. Next slide. The concept of the go team is that as quickly as possible, when you have one of these events happen, you assemble this spectrum of experts who are able to manage what we consider in three big domains. Next slide. Where immediately you have people who are trained in the art of event review, people who have understanding of human factors, where you can go in there, really understand these. And as I'll mention in a bit, in the context of RCA squared, where the focus is on real system redesign with identification of real sustainable changes that are more likely than others to really prevent this kind of thing in the future. And then you also have a component of this team that supports the caregivers and also patients and families. And this is very, very much like what they do in aviation. When there's a plane crash, there's that group who gets in there right away to investigate what happened. Then there's a group that supports the pilots, the air traffic controllers, the flight attendants, any other people involved in that, and then supporting the passengers and the passengers' families. This is modeled after this approach where you're maximizing the learning and also maximizing the support that goes on. Next slide. So we've recently done webinars around this RCA squared, which is really improving the root cause analysis. We use real cases we de-identified that we allow organizations to go through. We teach cognitive interviewing, to where these new interviewing techniques that allow you to be able to gain more information because you're creating so much trust between those you're interviewing and what happened in a particular event. So again, real substantive change in the way that heretofore we've often been responding. Next slide. So there's lots and lots of publications that have come out recently. And maybe at the end, we'll talk in the Q&A about a paper that came out yesterday that we published in the Journal of Patient Safety and Risk Management, entitled CRPs or CANDOR, Lessons Learned from the First 200 Hospitals. That again came out just yesterday. And a lot of information that through this work that we're doing with Iowa, we'll be able to share with all the organizations to kind of help you think about where you may find value in sort of doing this. But the data is out there showing that this kind of approach creates a reduction in serious harm events, increased reporting, and then a lot of our data is showing claims going down, cost decreasing, and a real important from the care for the caregiver standpoint, time to resolution in our data really, really began to decrease even further than what it had been in the early 2000s. And that has been seen all along with the other organizations who have adopted this. And finally, there's a paper in Health Services Research showing the folks that go through this practice a lot less defensive medicine, the docs do, who go through this kind of training. Next slide, which is my last slide. So often what sort of happens, this is kind of a general communication or CANDOR implementation kind of format, which for you will be optional if you want to take advantage of us. The first is that on-site gap analysis. We just completed report back in 7 hospitals over the last week, and the CEOs and the quality people just love the information that's given back to them, and it really helps them think about where they want to go next to go from good to great. And then there's these other steps that go along in terms of assessing people's communication skills, and then doing these workshops like you heard about we'll be doing this summer in the Iowa work around communication, care for the caregiver, event review, all those pieces of it, with the hope that we're going to be working with the really amazing med-mal insurers for the docs, the MMIC and the COPIC group, where we work with them to make sure the messaging is as appropriate as it can be. And so I think I'm going to wrap it up there, and now we can lead into the other part of the webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim, for that overview. That really helps a lot. So next we're going to hear from Dr. McCoy, Ray, and Deb about what CANDOR looks like in an Iowa hospital. Dr. McCoy is a board-certified OBGYN from West Burlington and serves as Chief Medical Officer at Great River Health System. In 2013, he chaired the IMS task force that identified the early disclosure concept. He has fought tirelessly ever since to help educate his peers around the state as we work to change the culture in Iowa from deny and defend to a more patient-focused approach of disclosure and continued engagement following an unanticipated outcome. As I mentioned, Dr. McCoy will be joined today by a Great River patient named Ray and his sister Deb, as they kind of talk us through what their experience was with the CANDOR process. I will turn it over to you.
Hey, welcome. Thank you. It's nice for everybody to be able to join us. I see we have a lot of participants, so I'm kind of excited about that. And I'd like to particularly thank Raymond and Deb for taking time out of their day and work to join us for this. It's I think, very valuable for everybody to have an idea to get their perspective. So I just want to go through and just give you a very brief history. I want to have more time for them to talk and then maybe for questions at the end. But next slide. So just a brief history. Our CANDOR bill was signed, as you see there. It became Iowa code through a unanimous vote of the House and Senate, and it became effective July 1st of 2015. Through a recent, just last year, it got, through some comprehensive tort reform, it got expanded, so now it includes any cause of physical injury and all members of the healthcare team, which was really very helpful. Next slide. We, as Dr. McDonald had mentioned, we went through the training, took our team out to Sanford, did the training, went to set up our team, as you see here, kind of had a plan to start this maybe around July 1st, started getting calls after we'd started doing training in the hospital, starting at the board level down through all the directors, supervisors, medical staff. Once staff kind of was aware, we started getting calls. So we started a little earlier than we anticipated. This is our team as it's set up. We have a process in place whereby you have a secure text so that if anyone in the healthcare system has something that they think could be a CANDOR or CRP and or CANDOR, and we can talk about the differences, a little bit of that later, same and different. All they have to do on our secure texting is type in the word CANDOR. It goes to all the members of our team. We sort of rally the troops and see who's available, since there's not a lot of us, but between all of us, we get the work done. So there's the members of our team. Next slide, please. So we sort of formed our team. We had our structure in place. We had a policy. We did a board presentation, getting buy-in from the health system from the top down. Presented this at all of our service meetings, leadership, all the way through as mentioned. And so we'll have some questions at the end, but just to give you a very brief, this was probably 6 months or so after we had started doing this. Our team got a secure message from one of the providers, one of the hospitalists, and said, I think maybe we have a CANDOR case for you. And so Heather, who helps head up a lot of our communications and kind of our patient contact, and I went up and started visiting. And I'll just give you a very brief history, and then I'm going to let Raymond and Deb talk. But Raymond had a foot wound. He went to the wound clinic, and he basically was on a potentially nephrotoxic antibiotic for treatment. But because of a process failure issue within the record, we weren't given him proper surveillance for that. He ended up with a kidney injury, had some acute tubular necrosis, ended up going through dialysis for a period of time. And so we went and talked to them initially. our thought was, though, we wanted to see how Raymond did. We didn't want to try to set up a CANDOR meeting right away because we wanted to have him time to get through dialysis and feel better, get partially recovered a little bit, and then sort of see how was his kidney function going to do. So realizing that we had to wait a while to get there, we did help Raymond with some living expenses because we knew there was some time frame there that he couldn't work and had to go through some dialysis. So we did that ahead of time to help keep him covered till we know we could get to our CANDOR meetings and kind of start the process. And so I'm just going to kind of leave it at that, and I'm going to let Raymond and Deb sort of talk to you about their perspective, and maybe if you could just kind of start out as when you first contacted our team and we came to talk to you, sort of what happened and what did you feel, and just give your experience.
This is Ray's sister, Deb. Ray was pretty out of it during quite a bit of the time, so a lot of it is he just doesn't remember so well. I guess we knew that something was wrong, and we pulled aside one of his, actually the surgeon that removed Ray's toes, and just said we felt like something was going on, and he immediately just, you know, not really consoled us, but confirmed to us that it would go further than this, and we would, you know, he got a hold of Dr. McCoy, and immediately Dr. McCoy and Heather Nelson came and talked to us, and very gently and very, you know, reassuring that they understood our worries and concerns, and that they would definitely be addressed. Everything was in a very calm manner, which was reassuring to us, and then eventually brought in the doctor in question in the wound clinic, and he was, I mean, everything was such a nice environment. There was no hostility. They gave us the time we needed to kind of cool down, explain to us how the process would work, and just, I mean, we couldn't be more, I mean, obviously it was, we didn't want my brother to be in the position he was, but giving what it was, they just were wonderful with us, and I don't think we would have wanted to go any other direction than the CANDOR.
So Raymond, once you got to the point where you're feeling a little better and things you could remember, what was your aspect of all of this from the time we started kind of talking to you and addressing the issues you had?
I guess what really was very calming to me is that first of all, they did come to me and say, look, there's a problem. We've messed up, and we're going to do the best we can to fix it. That was real reassuring to me that they were able to come out in the open and admit it without us having to, you know, do a bunch of digging around and investigative work. They just came out and said, look, this is what happened. We were in the wrong here. The doctors were just absolutely great. They got my kidneys working again, and very nice job on my amputations. And I was not an easy patient to work with. Throughout all this, I guess, it was reassuring to me that I wasn't going to have a big court battle with them for 2 years, and, you know, depending on how my kidneys were doing, and everything just went real smooth. You know, I was off work for 4 months probably with zero pay. So with them, they kind of fronted me a loan, so to speak, so I didn't lose my house and stuff like that. Just everything went real smooth for me. It was one less thing I didn't have to worry about. I could just concentrate on getting healthy, which was a nice deal for me.
So, and I anticipate hopefully maybe some of the participants will have some specific questions for Ray and Deb, because I'm sure you're thinking of things that we maybe haven't thought of. We've been through this a lot, but you know, I think through the process and going through this, trying to just be as transparent as we can, open and upfront. But I can tell you during that process, even though it took us a while to start to plan our CANDOR meetings and how we're going to get a resolution of this, we started process improvement and patient safety things right away. We identified the things that went wrong. We put a lot of things in place. You know, we had a wound clinic that was off of our integrated record. Everything else in our health system, long-term care, everything is all on one record. Unfortunately, the wound clinic was on a different record, and part of that was, I think, some of the problem we had here. We've now corrected that. The wound clinic's on the same record we're on. So we started process improvement things right away, and I think had those all in place probably sooner than anything, if this wouldn't have been resolved in this fashion, would have had depositions get started. I think the other thing that to me is important is through this process, we were able to kind of help identify some of Raymond's health issues, and we were able to help get him into seeing someone in the GI clinic, help getting into a primary care provider to look at some other things related to his diabetes follow-up and treatment. And so just sort of trying to look at things in general. And I think the other thing that is probably really important is, you know, Raymond and Deb and everybody in that, I think in their family, they're still members and get their care done within the health system. We haven't, those relationships were maintained instead of broken. And I think, as you all know, in a relationship that ends up in a litigious manner, how many of those relationships are still maintained after that? And I don't think too many. And so, you know, afterwards I can answer some questions about what we've done to date. I think we've had about 8 CANDOR meetings completed, and we have one that we're setting in process. We have a couple that are being set up. Some of these may seem somewhat minor, some of them are major, some with financial resolutions, half with not. I think a lot of times it's just being upfront with patients, answering their questions, and kind of treat them how you'd want to be treated, I think, sort of the bottom line. So I think with that, I'd like to just sort of give more time to wrap up here. And if anybody has questions of myself or Raymond or Deb, that would be great.
Great. Thank you all so much for that explanation. You know, it really helps drive home these ideas when we get a chance to actually see them in action and hear about how effective they can be. We'll leave some time for questions at the end. So next, we're going to hear from Shelley Davis with MMIC and Gary Tettenborn from COPIC. Shelley is a senior claim consultant at the professional liability company MMIC, and she handles claims and oversees the handling of lawsuits brought against healthcare providers. Shelley worked as a nurse before getting her law degree, and she represented healthcare providers for 20 years when they got sued before working at MMIC. She's a strong advocate of apology, communication, and early resolution, and regularly presents on the topic. Gary received his business administration degree from the University of Nebraska. He has 37 years of liability claims experience. The last 30 years has been in the area of medical malpractice claims, primarily occurring in the state of Nebraska. He has supervised other malpractice consultants in the states of Iowa, Kansas, and South Dakota. And he has been a senior claims consultant with COPIC since 2005. So, Shelley, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stacy. What you see before you is MMIC's apology and communication position statement. MMIC, as a professional liability carrier, felt so strong about apology, communication, and early resolution when possible that since 2015, we have taken a public position on facilitating the same. And so what that means for your providers is that when they are involved in an adverse outcome, whether or not there is medical negligence, MMIC will be there to support your providers. And when it comes to early resolution, if there is a determination that there was medical negligence, then MMIC will facilitate some sort of early resolution with the involved patients. I want to thank Deb and Ray for talking today. There is nothing stronger than hearing from involved patients we work with our providers all the time, and we hear that perspective, and they too suffer when they have been involved in some sort of adverse outcome with their patients. So I wanted to provide all of the participants in the webinar with MMIC's apology and communication position statement. If you are an MMIC insured, you will also have the ability to obtain what I would call our bundle of information. This bundle of information, as both Dr. McCoy and Dr. McDonald alluded to, comes from the national experts that have put together all sorts of information relative to putting together your own policy on how to deal with an adverse outcome with your providers. So there's information relative to apologizing, to communicating, to documenting, and to getting your insurance company involved in an early resolution in those types of cases. So I'm very happy to be here and talking with you, with Gary, and we have moved in a very different direction. We used to deny and defend, and now we are encouraging all of our providers to talk to their patients early, to apologize, and CANDOR is going to give all of the providers certain protections to encourage early resolution, apology, and communication. And these protections will help providers communicate better, I believe, because it will lessen their vulnerabilities. So with that, Gary, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Shelley. Again, I'm a claims consultant at COPIC. This is a relatively new process from my standpoint, from a claims standpoint. Not relatively new for COPIC and COPIC management. I think it was said earlier that Jerry Lewis Jenkins, both from a personal viewpoint and a professional viewpoint, has been very involved in the CANDOR and open disclosure type of process. I agree with Shelley that CANDOR is sort of a form of early intervention that we in the claims arena have been doing for years, but now we've got some safeguards as far as the disclosure. I think the foundation of CANDOR from a claims standpoint, from a claims adjuster, changing from that defend and deny type of mentality to the open disclosure and try to get these resolutions on cases, is the actual open disclosure, and that is the meeting with the patient, with the patient's family, going over the medical situation, talking to them about the complication, the adverse outcome, how it occurred. I think it was said earlier by one of the speakers that CANDOR, if you're in that process, can end up with some compensation to the patient for the situation when it's found that there is some fault involved with the healthcare providers. But there's also the situation where you can go through those open discussions with the patient and their family and come to the resolution that it was an unfortunate event. However, the care given was actually appropriate care. We've used the I'm sorry statutes in various states to help with that type of discussion. I think CANDOR takes that well above the I'm sorry, where you can really get into the nuts and bolts of the situation and the medical care. The slide that I put up here, I wanted to just briefly discuss from my perspective, what are some of the benefits of the CANDOR process rather than the old-fashioned claims handling, just talk to the patient, say, hey, no, the standard of care was met, do what you need to do. And I think the first benefit, it does apply to not only the patient and their family, to the insurance company with maybe lower expectations, lower litigation in that, and to the healthcare provider. I think all three have a benefit from the CANDOR process. I think the main one, and somebody else I think briefly mentioned it, and that is it may help maintain that doctor-patient relationship. I'm sure Shelley has been involved in litigation, and I have, where when you're at a deposition, you've heard the patient say, I wish I could still have Dr. X or Dr. Y still be my physician, but because of the litigation, we had to end our relationship. I think CANDOR helps maintain that doctor-patient relationship because there's been this open and honest discussion with the patient. So I think that's a big benefit that can happen. It's not going to happen in every case, but it can happen in a lot of cases. The other thing that I put on this slide is a lot of patients that I've talked to, or claimants, if you're talking in the claims arena, they just wanted to know why me. They wanted an explanation as to how come this happened to me. And I'll take some blame as far as the claims adjusters of the world and the defense attorneys. In the past, we put up that wall. We had talked to our healthcare providers and said, be very careful of what you say to the patient. Make sure you don't say anything that could be used as a statement against interest against you. And it stopped that communications, and it stopped the patient from really understanding how this complication or adverse outcome occurred. So I think CANDOR really does help when the doctor gets to sit down with the patient, with the protection, to go through the nuts and bolts of the treatment and really explain what were some of the decisions that this surgeon had to make during the operation. Is this just a risk of the procedure? What did he have to decide on, for an example, what spacers to use or different things in the surgery? So I think the CANDOR process may help the patient understand why this complication or how this complication occurred to them, so that they can basically get beyond that and work on how do I get better. I've now, I'm not sitting here thinking that this complication occurred because there was negligence, because we're all involved with family and friends. And I've had this happen to me numerous times when a friend or an acquaintance has had a bad outcome from a surgical procedure or an infection or whatever. And the first thing out of somebody's mind at a family function is, well, the doctors must have screwed up or the hospital must have screwed up. I think CANDOR allows us to have that open discussion and maybe give some closure to the patient as to strictly how the complication or this negative outcome occurred, so they can move on to trying to get better. Again, it helps prevent unnecessary litigation, because in the past, in a certain number of files I've had, the patient was just trying to find out answers, and the only way they could do it is through the litigation process. And if they would have had some of that information to begin with, they may not have gone down that litigation road. They may have been satisfied with the answers that they were given. And then the other benefit of it is what was been said here today, and where Ray and that were talking on those obvious cases, those cases where there has been an error made by the healthcare providers. We can skip this lengthy, drawn-out litigation process that can go on for years and years, that is very expensive with experts and all that, and get a resolution that is beneficial to both parties. Can you throw up the next slide? And lastly, just a couple thoughts that I had, and then I will stop. Number one is, from my perspective, CANDOR is a team approach regarding the healthcare provider, the risk management, patient safety, hospital or clinic administrator, and the insurance company. And then I should put in there, obviously, the patient and the patient's family. One of the things that I think is important is the selection of cases and events that are appropriate for CANDOR. From my perspective, I don't think CANDOR changes that a doctor and a patient after an adverse event need to have open communications right after the event. I think some doctors can handle that without going into the formal CANDOR process, but the CANDOR process is appropriate in a lot of cases. And one experience I had is when to offer the CANDOR process. It was basically a death in an operating room scenario, and they need to give enough time for the family to process the grief before you start giving these documents of sign this to do the CANDOR. So That was one thought I had about the CANDOR process, is developing a plan at your facility as to how to approach the patient and their family with the CANDOR process and how quickly to do that. And then just setting expectations. Because again, somebody had mentioned that there are a number of CANDOR cases that don't end up in compensation. I think at the initial CANDOR discussion, from my perspective, we have to be very open with, this is an open discussion to discuss what happened. This can end up in compensation, it may not. And lastly, the resolution part of it, it can be in two forms. Again, the compensation part, or explaining to everybody that this was an unfortunate event and, you know, there was really no negligence involved in this event, but to answer any and all questions as to how this complication or adverse outcome occurred. So I'm taking it a little different. I used a little bit of the old claims approach, but I have been very supportive, and I think the CANDOR process will do a lot to help educate the patients on what happened and prevent litigation, and compensate the patients without going through the real rigors and, you know, frustration of litigation. Any questions from that standpoint for me? Hello.
Okay. Thank you so much, Shelley and Gary, and thank you really to all of our speakers today. I think these presentations really give us an excellent overview of CANDOR as a whole from every perspective, from the patient, the provider, the insurer. So with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions that you may have for any of our presenters today. You can either type them in the chat box, or if you'd like to unmute your line, feel free. One question that we did have come in, Tim, maybe you can speak a little bit about this. Maybe can you explain the gap analysis process and a little bit about, you mentioned the paper that had just been published?
Sure. So the gap analysis process, and it actually hits a couple of comments, or certainly that comment that Lana Comstock just put up there about buy-in from administration and the hospital board. So one of the things that happens during the gap analysis is there's usually 8 or 9 facilitated conversations that we conduct from 7 in the morning till 7 at night. And it does include meeting with these groups of people where nobody's boss is in the room. So we do meet with board members, we do meet with the C-suite, hospital administration, medical staff leadership, medical staff, frontline, directors, managers, nurses, transporters, cafeteria people, all these different facilitated groups we meet with. And it's a 2-part process. One is kind of explaining to them what CANDOR is and getting a sense from them as where they think the organization is in terms of reporting, event review, just culture, communicating to patients and families, care for the caregiver, and that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of learning that happens within these groups. And that's where the C-suite and hospital administration really gets to ask a lot of questions, and we get to learn a lot from them. And all that's, again, put into a report that comes back to the organization. It's all done in a confidential way. We don't take names down. We sign BAA agreements. You know, we have all that sort of stuff. The other thing that we have is the ability to take the data from that organization and compare it with the hundreds of others that we have out there, so they can see where they are in some of their patient safety processes. So that's the kind of the quick explanation of how, again, how we go about doing that.
Great, thank you. We did have another question come in. Does CANDOR require you to have an attorney on site?
I would let Dr. McDonald chime in. I can just tell you what our thought process was here. The last thing we would want to do, and the nice thing about CANDOR is you're not a victim of the resolution. You get to have some control of the resolution. But the thing we did not want to do here is have a financial resolution without the patient or their family having an attorney represent them, because that just doesn't feel right. And we didn't want somebody walking away after a financial resolution sort of wondering, gosh, was that really okay? And so we have had for all the financial resolutions except one, and it was kind of an unusual situation. It was a very small amount. But for the most part, if there's any financial resolution, yes, we want the patients, for their benefit, to have an attorney present.
Yeah, and I would totally echo that. In the paper we published, we did hundreds of these over the course of 8 years of our study. But looking at the question, maybe from a little bit different from how Barb put it, you're not required to have an attorney on site at the hospital all the time. It's just when you have one of these events, it's important when you activate the process that the organization has access to legal counsel. And then I agree with Mike, the patient and family need legal counsel if you're going to go down that path of resolution that involves finance. Now, I can say one of the best scenarios we encountered a lot was we would allow patients and families to have lawyers there even when we were explaining the fact that our care was okay. And that was super valuable, because then those lawyers knew if there was a lawsuit, we were going to dig in and we would likely win. But again, we would probably have our attorney there as well if patients and families wanted them there. But that's the kind of bifurcated way of trying to answer this question in terms of attorneys and access to them.
Great, thank you for that. I'm not seeing any other questions come in right now, and I'm hoping all of you, would you be available if questions do come up in the future, if we could shoot a message to you and get those answered?
Absolutely, yes.
Perfect.
Sure.
That would be great. So as I stated at the top of the hour, we are going to be doing a summer CANDOR training series starting in June. And really, we'll walk you through all of the different elements of CANDOR and give you the tools necessary should you choose to implement this early disclosure process at your facility. So, and as I mentioned, I will send out the informational packet with additional details to all of you on the call today. And Tim, would we be able to send out a link to that paper that you mentioned?
Oh, you bet. When we're done here, so for sure, when we're done here, I'll email it to you. And then you should be able to make it available to people who want to see it.
Perfect. Yeah, and we would love to have you consider participating. So if you are interested, please email me at the address listed there on the screen, and I'd be happy to help in whatever ways I can. So that concludes our call for today. We'll give you 3 minutes of your day back. Thank you all so much for joining us, and have a wonderful weekend. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you.